Welcome to my channel.
The snow began in the deep hours of the night, falling not in a flurry but in thick, heavy flakes that blanketed the village of Lochstub in a profound, muffling silence. By morning, the Scottish Highlands had been transformed into a stark white canvas, isolating the village completely from the demands of the outside world. This suited Police Constable Hamish Macbeth perfectly. He sat by his roaring peat fire, a chipped mug of strong coffee in one hand, stretching his long legs toward the heat. His dog, Tozer, was a snoring lump of fur on the rug, and the station telephone had been rendered blissfully dead by the weight of snow on the lines. For a man who viewed police work as a tragic interruption to a peaceful existence, the weather was a gift from the Almighty. Hamish took a slow sip of his coffee and contemplated the day. His primary ambition was to avoid leaving the warmth of his station, perhaps throwing a few scraps to his wildcat, Sonsi, and waiting for the smell of Mrs. Wellington's baking to drift down the street. But a rumbling in his stomach, sharp and demanding, informed him that his meagre pantry was entirely devoid of bacon. With a heavy sigh that conveyed the tragedy of his situation, he pulled on his heavy greatcoat, jammed his peaked cap onto his fiery red hair, and stepped out into the freezing, pristine morning. He trudged down the centre of the waterfront street, the snow squeaking beneath his heavy boots. The sea loch was the colour of bruised iron, the mountains beyond hidden by low, heavy clouds. He was heading toward the Lochstub Hotel, hoping to mooch a plate of eggs off Mrs. Anstruther, when the sound of an aggressive, grating voice broke the village's peaceful insulation. It was coming from the general store. Hamish pushed open the door of the shop, shaking the snow from his coat. Inside, Mrs. Wellington, the formidable postmistress, was standing behind her counter with an expression that suggested she was contemplating murder. Opposite her stood a man who was entirely out of place in the rugged Highlands. He had arrived the previous evening on the last rickety bus from Strathbane, dragging leather suitcases and a misplaced sense of superiority. His name was Arthur Pendleton, an English historian and self-proclaimed expert on rural architecture, who had rented a small cottage near the manse to study the primitive structures of the north. Pendleton was currently jabbing a gloved finger at a display of tin shortbread. He wore a pristine, mustard-coloured tailored overcoat and a look of profound distaste. He was speaking loudly, as if addressing someone terribly hard of hearing or profoundly stupid. "I simply do not understand how you people survive in this cultural wasteland," Pendleton announced, his voice carrying the sharp, clipped tones of a man accustomed to being obeyed in expensive London restaurants. "I asked for a decent sourdough, or perhaps a jar of organic marmalade, and you present me with bread that feels like damp foam and preserves that are entirely synthetic. It is barbaric. And furthermore, I expect my mail to be delivered to my door, not left in this disorganized hovel for me to fetch like a common errand boy." Mrs. Wellington drew herself up to her full, intimidating height. "The bread is fresh from the baker in Strathbane, Mr. Pendleton. And as for the mail, the snow is 2 feet deep. If you want your letters, you can carry them yourself, or you can wait until spring." Pendleton sneered, turning just as Hamish shambled fully into the shop. "Ah," Pendleton said, looking the policeman up and down with sneering amusement. "The local constabulary. I suppose you are the reason the roads are entirely impassable. Too busy drinking tea to shovel a path for the taxpayers, are we?" Hamish let his face relax into a mask of total, vacant compliance. He blinked slowly, scratching his chin as if trying to process a highly complex mathematical equation. "Well now, sir," Hamish said, his voice a soft, slow Highland drawl. "The snow falls where it likes, and shoveling it while it's still falling is a bit like trying to empty the loch with a teaspoon. But I am sure the council will send a plough when they remember we are here." "Incompetence," Pendleton muttered, grabbing a tin of the offending shortbread and tossing a crisp banknote onto the counter. "Absolute incompetence from top to bottom. I have an appointment with the minister's wife, Mrs. Brodie, to discuss the disgraceful state of the church archives. I can only hope she possesses half a brain, though given the local standard, I shall not hold my breath." He left the store, leaving the door wide open to the freezing wind. Hamish gently closed it, his hazel eyes losing their dopey glaze for a brief, sharp second. Pendleton was a man actively seeking enemies in a place where people remembered grudges for generations. As Hamish turned back to Mrs. Wellington, mentally calculating the odds of securing a free breakfast, he had a dark, sinking feeling that the pristine snow of Lochstub was not going to stay clean for very long. The bell above the shop door gave a final, agitated jingle as Arthur Pendleton vanished into the swirling white gloom. Mrs. Wellington stood frozen behind her counter, her knuckles white as she gripped a rolling pin that had seen better days. "That man!" she hissed, her voice trembling with a rare, cold fury that made even Hamish take a half step back. He has the manners of a rutting stag and the heart of a midwinter gale. Calling my shop a hovel! I should have charged him triple for that shortbread, the arrogant Sassenach. Hamish nodded sympathetically, his mind already drifting toward the prospect of a hot breakfast, but the heavy silence that followed Pendleton's departure felt strangely fragile. He offered a mournful smile to the postmistress, gathered a small loaf of bread that wasn't quite as soft as foam, and stepped back out into the freezing Highland air. The walk toward the Lochstub Hotel was shorter than it felt, though the snow was now piling up against the whitewashed walls of the cottages like drifted sugar. Hamish was just reaching the stone steps of the hotel, dreaming of a pot of strong tea and a side of black pudding, when a high-pitched, piercing scream shattered the muffled quiet of the village. It wasn't the sound of the wind or a distressed gull, it was the unmistakable cry of a human being in total, unadulterated shock. Hamish sighed, the sound a low plume of steam in the air. His day of avoiding work had lasted exactly 22 minutes. He turned on his heel, his lanky frame moving with a sudden deceptive efficiency, and began to run toward the sound. The scream had come from the direction of the old manse, the imposing stone residence of the minister, Mr. Brodie. As Hamish rounded the corner of the kirk, his boots sinking deep into the fresh drifts, he saw a small crowd already gathering. At the centre of the commotion was Mrs. Brodie, the minister's wife, a woman usually known for her iron-clad composure and her ability to organise a church feast with military precision. Now, however, she was leaning against a frozen rowan tree, her face as pale as the snow beneath her feet, pointing a trembling hand toward the kirkyard's stone entrance. Hamish pushed through the curious locals, his hazel eyes scanning the scene with a sharp, hidden intensity. There, wedged firmly into the narrow stone archway that led to the archives, was Arthur Pendleton. The man who had been lecturing the village on architecture only minutes ago was now a permanent, if somewhat undignified, part of the scenery. He was stuck fast in the archway, his expensive mustard-coloured coat bunched up around his ears. He was suspended several inches off the ground, his polished leather shoes dangling uselessly in the air. At first glance, it looked like a ridiculous prank, a local response to his earlier insults, but as Hamish drew closer, the humour of the situation evaporated into the freezing air. Pendleton's eyes were wide and bulging, staring at the grey Highland sky with an expression of profound surprise. Around his neck, pulled tight enough to disappear into the flesh, was a length of sturdy, old-fashioned bell rope, the kind used in the kirk tower for generations. The rope had been looped over the iron bar of the archway, turning the architectural feature into a makeshift and highly public gallows. The man was stone dead, his face a mottled, angry purple that clashed horribly with his stylish coat. Hamish stood before the body, his hands pushed deep into his pockets, looking for all the world like a confused tourist rather than a man who had seen more than his fair share of Highland tragedies. "Right then," Hamish murmured, more to himself than the crowd. "This is a very untidy business." He looked at the snow surrounding the archway. It was a chaotic mess of footprints, mostly belonging to the villagers who had rushed to Mrs. Brodie's aid, but beneath the fresh layers he could see the deeper indentations of a struggle. Tozer, who had caught up with his master, gave a low, mournful cry and sat down in the snow, refusing to go any closer. Hamish reached out a large, freckled hand and touched the hem of Pendleton's coat. It was bone-dry, meaning he hadn't been outside long enough for the snow to melt. "Did anyone see him after he left the shop?" Hamish asked, his voice soft but carrying clearly over the murmurs of the crowd. Mrs. Brodie finally found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. "He was coming to see me, Hamish. I was waiting in the parlour with the tea things. When he didn't arrive, I went to the gate, and I found him like this." She clutched her shawl tighter, her eyes darting toward the body, and then quickly away. Hamish noted the way her hands shook, but he also noted something else, a small, dark smudge on her white woolen sleeve that looked remarkably like iron rust from the archive door. He didn't say a word, merely nodded in his slow, deceptive way, knowing that the real police from Strathbane would be here soon to make a mess of everything. The silence of the kirkyard, heavy with the weight of the snow and the grisly sight of Arthur Pendleton swinging gently in the wind, was shattered by the distant, aggressive wail of a police siren. It was a sound that didn't belong in Lochstub, a shrill, urban intrusion that signalled the end of any local common sense. Hamish Macbeth stood by the archway, his hands deep in his pockets and his shoulders hunched against the biting cold, watching as a mud-spattered police van roared around the corner, skidding dangerously on the icy track before slamming to a halt near the manse gates. The doors flew open with a violence that suggested the occupants were clearing a path through a riot rather than arriving at a quiet Highland village. Out stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair, a man whose physical presence was roughly equivalent to a sack of angry potatoes squeezed into a cheap overcoat. His face was already a dangerous shade of purple, a hue that seemed to be his permanent state of being whenever he was forced to leave the comforts of Strathbane. Behind him trailed the perpetually exhausted Detective Jimmy Anderson, looking as though he had already spent several hours being shouted at in the confined space of the van. Blair stomped toward the kirkyard, his heavy boots obliterating the delicate patterns in the snow that Hamish had been quietly studying. "Out of the way, Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the kirk and causing several crows to take flight in a black, flapping panic. He shoved past Hamish, nearly knocking the lanky constable into a snowdrift. "What in the name of all that is holy have you been doing? Standing there like a garden gnome while a taxpayer is hung out to dry." I might have known yow'd be useless the moment a real crime occurred. Blair stopped in front of the archway, his eyes bulging as he took in the sight of Pendleton in his mustard coat. Good God, it's a Sassenach. Rich in appearance, this is exactly what happens when you let these primitive hills go unpoliced. Hamish remained where he was, his face a mask of dull, slow-witted compliance. "He's stone dead, sir," Hamish offered in his softest Highland lilt. "I thought it best not to touch anything until the professionals arrived. The bell rope is from the kirk tower, I believe." Blair ignored him, turning instead to bark orders at Anderson. "Get the photographer! Get the tape! And find out who found the body. I want names, addresses, and a list of every local who looked at this man sideways in the last 24 hours. He rounded on Mrs. Brodie, who was still leaning against the rowan tree, looking frail and distraught. "You! Woman! I suppose you're the one who started this caterwauling. What do you know about this?" Mrs. Brodie flinched, her eyes wide with fresh alarm. Before she could speak, Hamish stepped forward, looking entirely harmless and slightly confused. "This is the minister's wife, sir, Mrs. Brodie. She was just about to have the poor man in for tea when she found him like this. Shiz had a terrible shock." Blair snorted, a sound of pure contempt. "A shock? In my experience, these village types are as tough as old leather and twice as cunning. She's probably hiding something. Look at her trembling like a leaf. That's guilt, Macbeth, if you had the brains to recognise it. I've seen it 1,000 times in the tenements of Glasgow." He turned back to Pendleton's body, poking at the expensive leather shoes with the tip of his baton. "It's obvious what's happened here. A robbery gone wrong, or a local grudge. Some Highland savage took offence at his accent and decided to play at being a hangman. We'll start with the most likely candidates. Who's the village drunk? Who's been poaching? Who's the most shiftless, layabout character in Lochdub?" Blair paused, staring directly at Hamish with a sneer. "Besides yourself, of course." "Well now, sir," Hamish scratched his red hair, looking thoughtful. "There is Angus Maclure, but he's away in Lereg for the sheep sales. And there is Willie Lamont, but he's been in bed with the flu for a week." Blair dismissed this with a wave of his hand. "Lies! I'll bet my pension it was one of your honest crofters. Anderson, get the minister's wife to the station. I'll interrogate her myself. Macbeth, you stay here and guard the scene. And for heaven's sake, try not to fall asleep or lose the body. I'll be back to deal with you once I've solved this in record time." As Blair marched away, his boots crunching loudly in the frozen slush, Hamish looked at the mustard-coloured coat of the dead man and then at the iron rust smudge on Mrs. Brodie's sleeve. He knew Blair was heading in the wrong direction at a high rate of speed, but he wasn't about to correct him. He had his own way of finding the truth, and it didn't involve shouting at frightened women in a cold interview room. He whistled low for Tozer, who emerged from behind a gravestone, and together they began to wait for the silence to return. The violent slamming of the police van's doors echoed through the kirkyard, a final, jarring punctuation mark to DCI Blair's departure. Hamish stood in the falling snow, his lanky frame hunched against the biting wind, and watched the tail lights disappear toward the village police station. Blair was convinced that a terrified Mrs. Brodie was the key to a simple, thuggish robbery, and he was currently halfway toward terrifying the poor woman into a false confession. Hamish, however, knew that the minister's wife was as likely to commit a murder as she was to skip a Sunday service. He also knew that the iron rust smudge on her sleeve hadn't come from the archway where Pendleton swung, but from the heavy, neglected side door of the Kirk archivisor door that had supposedly been locked for months. "Right then, Tozer," Hamish murmured, the dog looking up with a sceptical whine. "Since the professionals are busy shouting at the innocent, I suppose we'd best find out what the guilty are up to." He didn't follow Blair to the station. Instead, he turned his back on the crime scene and trudged through the deepening drifts toward the heart of the village. His stomach gave a sharp, indignant growl, reminding him that the drama of the morning had effectively cheated him out of his breakfast. In Lochdub, information was rarely found in an interrogation room. It was baked into the crust of a meat pie or stirred into a third dram of whiskey. He headed first to the back door of the Lochdub Hotel. Mrs. Anstruther was in the kitchen, her face a mask of grim determination as she pummeled a mound of dough. The air was thick with the scent of yeast and roasting ham. "Hamish Macbeth," she barked without looking up. "I suppose you're looking for a free handout while that poor Sassenach is still cooling in the kirkyard. I heard Blair is back. The man's a menace to peace." "Is thou?" Mrs. A., Hamish said, sliding onto a wooden stool and looking mournful. "He's got the minister's wife in the station right now. Thinks she's a criminal mastermind. It's a terrible strain on a man's nerves seeing such injustice." Mrs. Anstruther snorted, but she reached for a plate and piled it high with thick slices of ham and a generous dollop of mustard. "Injustice. The injustice is that Pendleton man poking his nose into things that didn't concern him. He was in here yesterday afternoon, drinking mineral water, and asking far too many questions about the church silver and the old parish records." Hamish paused with a forkful of ham halfway to his mouth. "The parish records? I thought he was an architect." Mrs. Anstruther wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes narrowing. "He claimed to be, but he spent 3 hours in the corner with the postmistress, Mrs. Wellington. And she wasn't selling him stamps, Hamish. They were arguing. I caught a bit of it when I brought over his bill. Something about a lost inheritance and a stolen name. He told her that if the truth came out, half the village would be looking for new houses." Hamish chewed slowly, his mind whirring beneath his deceptive, sleepy gaze. If Pendleton was digging into the archives, he wasn't just looking at the stones, he was looking at the skeletons in the village closet. He finished his ham, thanked Mrs. Anstruther, with a wink that promised a future favour, and sloshed his way back to the general store. The shop was empty of customers, the bell giving a lonely chime as he entered. "Mrs." Wellington was sitting by the stove, her face pale and her hands unusually still. "He was a nasty man, Hamish," she said before he could even speak. "A nasty, prying man who thought he could come up here and undo 50 years of history just because he had a fancy degree." Hamish leaned against the counter, looking as though he might fall asleep at any moment. "History is a heavy thing to carry, Mrs. Wellington. Was he bothering you about the Brodie family? Or perhaps someone closer to home?" She didn't answer, but her eyes darted toward a small, locked cabinet behind the till where the old ledger books were kept. "He found something he shouldn't have," she whispered, "and he thought he could use it to make himself rich. He didn't understand that in Lochdub we keep our own secrets." Hamish nodded, his red hair dusted with melting snow. He had learned more in 20 minutes of mooching than Blair would learn in 10 hours of bullying. Pendleton hadn't been killed for his wallet head, been killed because he was a blackmailer who had underestimated the fierce, silent loyalty of the Highlands. As he retreated into the cold, Hamish knew his next stop wouldn't be the station. He needed to find Priscilla Halberton Smythe. If there was a secret worth killing for in the parish records, the local aristocracy would surely have heard a whisper of it. The snow was falling with a renewed, heavy determination as Hamish trudged up the long, winding driveway toward Castle Halberton. The grand stone edifice loomed out of the white mist like a weary giant, its many windows staring blankly at the frozen loch below. Hamish felt the usual tug of inadequacy that always accompanied a visit to the castle, a feeling exacerbated by his damp uniform and the lingering scent of Mrs. Anstruther's mustard on his breath. He wasn't there to report a crime. Blair was currently doing enough of that for 10 men but to find a sounding board. Priscilla Halberton Smythe, the colonel's daughter, possessed a sharp, cool intellect that often saw through the social pretences Hamish found so baffling. He was halfway to the heavy oak doors when a silver Land Rover purred up behind him, its tyres crunching effortlessly through the deep drifts. The window slid down, revealing Priscilla's aristocratic features, framed by a silk headscarf that probably cost more than Hamish's annual boot allowance. She looked at him with a mixture of amusement and genuine concern. "Hamish," she said, her voice like clear water over Highland stones. "I heard the news. The village is buzzing like a disturbed hive. Is it true about the bell rope?" Hamish leaned against the cold metal of the door, removing his cap to reveal a shock of damp, fiery hair. "It is, Priscilla. A very messy business. And made all the messier by DCI Blair, who is currently convinced the minister's wife is a cold-blooded assassin." Priscilla killed the engine and stepped out, her movements graceful despite the treacherous footing. She led him toward the side entrance, a smaller, warmer door that led directly into the library. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and beeswax, a welcome change from the biting wind. "Mrs. Brodie?" Priscilla asked, shedding her coat. "That's ridiculous. She wouldn't hurt a fly, though she might lecture on its Sunday attendance." But Pendleton, he was another matter entirely. He was here last week, Hamish. He cornered Papa in the study, talking about the legitimacy of local holdings and the genealogical inconsistencies in the parish registers. Hamish sank into a leather armchair that felt like it might swallow him whole. Did he know? And how did the Colonel take to that? Priscilla walked over to a sideboard and poured 2 glasses of sherry, handing one to Hamish. Papa told him to get out before he set the dogs on him. But Pendleton wasn't deterred. He claimed that a branch of the Brodie Familith ones who originally endowed the Kirk Archiveshad, a secret that would invalidate half the land deeds in Lochstub. He called it the Great Highland Fraud. Hamish took a sip of the sherry, the warmth blooming in his chest. A fraud, is it? Mrs. Wellington at the shop seemed very rattled by him too. She mentioned a stolen name. Priscilla sat opposite him, her blue eyes narrowing. That sounds like the old story of the lost Brodies. There was a rumour a century ago that the true heir to the estate wasn't the one who inherited, but a child born on the wrong side of the blanket who was spirited away. If Pendleton found proof of that in the archives, he wasn't just an architect, he was a blackmailer, holding a knife to the throat of the village's establishment. Hamish stared at the amber liquid in his glass, the pieces of the puzzle shifting. So, he goes to the archives to find his proof, but someone gets there first, or someone follows him. But who would know? Priscilla asked, leaning forward. Only someone with constant access to the Kirk. Someone who knows the rhythms of the manse better than anyone. Hamish nodded slowly, his mind returning to the iron rust smudge on Mrs. Brodie's sleeve. And someone who knows that Pendleton was a greedy, arrogant man who could be lured into a trap by the promise of more evidence. He stood, placing the empty glass on a mahogany table. "Thank you for the sherry, Priscilla. It cleared my head better than the Highland air." She watched him go, a small, worried frown on her face. "Be careful, Hamish. Blair is looking for a scapegoat, and if you get in his way, hell have you transferred to a rainy beat in Glasgow before the week is out." Hamish smiled, a slow, deceptive lilt to his lips. "I've no intention of going to Glasgow, Priscilla. The coffee there is far too bitter." The warmth of the sherry was a fading memory as Hamish stepped back out into the biting Highland wind, the heavy oak doors of Castle Halberton thudding shut behind him. The sky had turned a bruised metallic violet, the kind of hue that signalled a long, frozen night ahead. He trudged back down the driveway, his boots crunching rhythmically in the fresh powder. If Priscilla was right, Arthur Pendleton hadn't just been an annoying Sassenach with a penchant for sour bread, he had been a man digging for a lever to upend the very foundations of Lochstub. A lost Brodie heir would mean land disputes, lost titles, and the kind of social upheaval that would turn the village upside down. As he reached the bottom of the hill, the blue flashing lights of the police van cut through the twilight, reflecting off the whitewashed walls of the station. Hamish arrived just in time to see DCI Blair stomping out onto the pavement, his face a triumphant, glowing red. Behind him, Jimmy Anderson was leading a weeping Mrs. Brodie toward the back of the van. The minister, Mr. Brodie, was standing on the steps, his hands raised in a gesture of helpless, holy despair. "There he is!" Blair roared, spotting Hamish. "The village idiot returns from his afternoon stroll. Well, Macbeth, you can stop scratching your head. I've cracked it. A motive as old as the hills, greed and a desperate cover-up. We found the incriminating evidence right in the manse, tucked under the cushions of the sofa. A set of letters from Pendleton to the minister, demanding £5,000 to keep quiet about a certain genealogical discrepancy in the Kirk records." Hamish stayed where he was, leaning against a frozen lamppost, looking for all the world like a man who had accidentally wandered into the wrong film. "Letter, sir?" Hamish asked, his voice soft and deceptively vacant. "And did the minister admit to writing them back? Or did Mrs. Brodie confess to the hanging?" Blair snorted, a sound of pure, concentrated arrogance. "She doesn't have to confess. We found the rust on her sleeve, the same iron rust from the archive door, and we found a length of bell rope in the garden shed that matches the one used on the victim. She clearly lured him to the archway under the pretense of a meeting, knocked him senseless with a heavy object likely a silver candlestick and hauled him up. It's a textbook, Macbeth. A panicked woman protecting her husband's reputation. But, sir," Hamish scratched his red hair, looking thoughtful. "Mrs. Brodie is barely 5 feet tall and has the constitution of a wet sparrow. Pendleton was a solid man. To hoist him into that archway would take the strength of a Highland gillie, or at least someone used to hauling heavy weights. "Don't you try to teach me about physics," Blair snapped, poking a thick finger into Hamish's chest. "Adrenaline, Macbeth, adrenaline and malice. She's going to Strathbane tonight, and I'm calling the chief constable to report a closed case. You can go back to your sheep and your poaching. You're lucky I don't charge you with obstruction for your sheer, staggering incompetence." He climbed into the van, slamming the door with a finality that made the windows rattle. As the vehicle roared away, skidding on the icy corner, Hamish stood alone in the dark. He looked at the minister, who was now sitting on the station steps with his head in his hands. Hamish walked over and placed a large, freckled hand on the man's shoulder. "Now then, Mr. Brodie," Hamish said, his lilt gentle. "Don't you worry too much. DCI Blair is a man who sees what he wants to see, not what's actually there. Those letters, they were typed, were they not?" The minister looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "Yes, Hamish, on an old machine, but I never saw them. I swear on the word, I never saw them until that man started tearing the parlour apart. And my wife, she only went to the archives to find a knitting pattern shed left there last month." Hamish nodded, his eyes sharpening as he looked toward the general store. The evidence was far too perfect, the rust too convenient, and the motive too tidy. Someone had wanted the police to find those letters, and they had known exactly where Mrs. Brodie would be at the time of the discovery. They had used Blair's predictable vanity as a weapon. Hamish knew he had to act quickly before the trail went as cold as the Highland night. He needed to find the one person who handled everyone's mail, knew everyone's business, and possessed an old typewriter that no one would ever think to check. The red taillights of the police van flickered like dying embers before vanishing into the swirling white void of the Highland night. Hamish stood in the middle of the road, the silence of Lochstub returning with a heavy, suffocating weight. Beside him, the minister remained slumped on the station steps, a broken man whose faith in earthly justice had been shattered by the blunt instrument of DCI Blair's ambition. Hamish reached out a large, freckled hand and patted the clergyman's shoulder, a gesture of quiet solidarity that said more than any sermon. He knew the letters Blair had found were a theatrical plant, designed to exploit the inspector's love for a tidy, sensationalist arrest. Someone in this village was playing a very clever game, using the Sassenach Pendleton's greed as a shield for a much older, deeper resentment. "Go home, Mr. Brodie," Hamish said, his voice a soft, low rumble. "Get some tea into you and keep the fire stoked. He'll be seeing things." The minister looked up, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. "But they've taken her, Hamish. They've taken my Mary to that cold place in Strathbane." Hamish gave a slow, deceptive smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Strathbane is a long drive in this snow, and Blair is a man who stops for his supper. There's enough time yet." He watched the minister shuffle away toward the manse, his shadow long and jagged against the snow, before turning his gaze toward the general store. The shop was dark, the windows frosted over with delicate, crystalline patterns that obscured the interior. To an outsider, it looked like the very picture of rural peace, but Hamish knew that behind those walls sat Mrs. Wellington, a woman who possessed the ultimate power in a small village. She knew who was writing to whom, and more importantly, who was running out of money. Hamish whistled for Tozer, who emerged from the lee of a stone wall, and together they made their way toward the back of the store, avoiding the front street. He knew the layout of every building in Lochstub better than his own palm. He knew which floorboards creaked and which doors were never truly locked. He found the small, detached shed where the postmistress kept her overflow of tinned goods and old packing crates. The padlock was hanging open, a telltale sign of haste. Hamish entered, the air smelling of dry cardboard and ancient dust. He clicked on his heavy torch, the beam cutting through the gloom until it landed on a draped cloth in the corner. He pulled the fabric away to reveal a heavy, cast-iron Underwood typewriter, its keys dusty but the ribbon relatively fresh. Beside it lay a stack of carbon paper and a few discarded sheets of parchment, same high-quality cream paper Hamish had seen on Pendleton's desk at the cottage. The motive was suddenly as clear as the Highland air. It wasn't about a lost Brodie heir or an ancient land deed. It was about something far more petty and human, social embarrassment and a long-standing grudge. Hamish remembered a piece of gossip from 20 years ago, something about a young Mrs. Wellington and a scandal involving the previous minister, a scandal that had been hushed up by the Kirk elders to protect the village's reputation. Pendleton, in his digging through the archives, hadn't found a lost king. He had found proof of the postmistress' past, and he had intended to use it to humiliate her, perhaps even to force her out of the shop she had occupied for decades. Mrs. Wellington hadn't killed him for money, she had killed him to preserve the only thing she had left there standing in the community. She had lured him to the archives under the pretense of handing over the real documents, then used the heavy bell rope from the tower, which she alone had access to as the Kirk's keyholder, to end the threat. The letters to the minister were her masterstroke, a way to point the finger at the one family the village would never suspect, knowing Blair would jump at the chance to arrest a person standing. She had played on the social dynamics of the Highlands like a piper with a well-tuned set of drones. Hamish stood in the cold shed, the torchlight reflecting in his hazel eyes. He had the weapon, he had the motive, and he had the motive, and he had the means. Now, he just needed to set the trap that would make the invisible killer step into the light before Blair reached Strathbane. The heavy scent of dry cardboard and cold oil seemed to thicken in the small shed as Hamish clicked off his torch, plunging the space back into a dense, velvety blackness. He stood for a moment, listening to the wind howl through the gaps in the wooden slats, a sound like a mourning piper on a distant ridge. He knew Mrs. Wellington was likely sitting in her parlour just a few yards away, perhaps sipping a medicinal brandy and congratulating herself on her own cleverness. She had played DCI Blair like a well-worn fiddle, handing him a high-profile arrest on a silver platter, all while burying her own past under the weight of the minister's reputation. But she had forgotten one thing. Hamish Macbeth did not look for grand conspiracies or high-stakes drama. He looked for the small, messy details people left behind when they were in a hurry to be innocent. "Right then, Tozer," Hamish whispered, his voice barely audible over the gale. "We've the evidence, but we lack the theatre. And without the theatre, Blair will never let the poor minister's wife go." He stepped out of the shed, careful to leave the draped cloth exactly as he had found it, and made his way back toward the village police station. The building was dark now, the blue lamp outside flickering in the wind, but Hamish didn't go inside. Instead, he went to the public telephone box on the corner, the glass panes rattling in their frames. He dropped a coin into the slot and dialed the number for the Lochdub Hotel. When Mrs. Anstruther answered, her voice sharp with the stress of the day, Hamish adopted his most frantic, breathless tone, a sharp departure from his usual Highland drawl. "Mrs. A!" "It's Hamish. Listen, you must tell everyone you see. I've just had a call from the forensic laboratory in Strathbane. It seems they found a specific type of ink on the victim's neck ink from an old-fashioned typewriter ribbon. They say it's a very rare violet shade, discontinued years ago. They are sending a team with chemical sensors to check every shop and office in the county starting at dawn. If that ink is found on someone's hands or a machine," Thayer finished. He didn't wait for her to ask questions before hanging up. He knew the Lochdub Telegraph would do the rest of the work. Within 20 minutes, every soul in the village would know about the violet ink, and the person who had spent the last hour scrubbing their fingers would be in a state of absolute, shivering panic. Hamish then made a second call, this one to the police radio room in Strathbane. He knew the dispatcher, a girl named Mary, who had a soft spot for his red hair and his stories of the hills. "Mary, be a dear and patch a message through to DCI Blair's van. Tell him there's been a secondary development at the Kirk archives. Tell him I've found the missing ledger Pendleton was looking for, and it's got the real killer's name written in the margin. Tell him, if he wants the full glory, he'd best turn that van around before he reaches the city limits." He knew Blair's greed for a perfect case would outweigh his desire for a warm bed. The trap was set. The killer would be driven by fear to dispose of the typewriter, and Blair would be driven by vanity to return to the scene of the crime. Hamish walked back to the kirkyard, the snow now reaching his knees in the deeper drifts. He settled himself into the shadows of the old stone archive building, pulling his greatcoat tight around him. Tozer huffed a breath of steam and tucked his nose under his tail. The village was a ghost town, the only light coming from the moon as it struggled to pierce the heavy clouds. Then, through the white haze, Hamish saw a figure approaching. It was a stout, determined shape, bundled in a heavy wool coat and a thick scarf. The figure was carrying a heavy, rectangular object wrapped in a dark cloth underwood typewriter. The figure didn't go toward the loch, where the ice would have prevented a quiet disposal. Instead, they headed straight for the deep, narrow well at the back of the Kirk garden, a place that hadn't been used in a century. Hamish watched as Mrs. Wellington reached the edge of the stone circle, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. She raised the heavy machine, her arms trembling with the effort. She was just about to send her secrets to the bottom of the earth, when the twin beams of a car's headlights swung around the corner of the manse, illuminating her in a harsh, unforgiving glare. The police van had returned. The blinding glare of the police van's headlights sliced through the falling snow, pinning Mrs. Wellington against the ancient stone lip of the well like a moth to a corkboard. The heavy underwood typewriter, still draped in its dark cloth, wobbled precariously in her trembling arms. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the low, rhythmic thrum of the idling engine and the frantic whistling of the wind through the kirk's eaves. Then, the van door creaked open with a violent snap, and DCI Blair's boots hit the frozen slush with the weight of a falling anvil. He marched into the light, his face a mask of bewildered fury, followed closely by a shivering Jimmy Anderson. "What in the name of the devil is going on here?" Blair bellowed, his voice cracking the Highland silence. "Macbeth, you told me there was a ledger. You said the killer's name was written in the margin." He squinted at the huddled figure by the well, his eyes bulging as he recognized the village postmistress. "Mrs. Wellington? What are you doing out here in a blizzard carrying a piece of office equipment?" Hamish stepped out from the deep shadows of the archive building, his lanky frame unfolding slowly. He didn't look like a man who had just solved a murder. He looked like a man who had misplaced his keys and was vaguely annoyed about the search. "Now then, sir," Hamish said, his voice a soft, deceptive lilt. "I believe Mrs. Wellington was just about to tidy up a bit of old history. That machine she's holding, it's a very particular model, the kind that leaves a very particular mark on a piece of cream-coloured parchment." Mrs. Wellington's face, usually so composed and formidable, was a mask of sheer, jagged panic. Her breath came in ragged white plumes. "He was going to ruin me, Hamish!" she cried, her voice thin and desperate. "He found the records from the year of the Great Fire. He knew I wasn't who I said I was. He was going to tell everyone that my father was a common thief, and that I'd stolen the shop's deed from the old minister's desk. I couldn't let him do it. I've worked 40 years for my respectability." Blair's jaw dropped, his mind struggling to pivot from the minister's wife to the woman standing before him. "The records? You killed a man over a 40-year-old shop deed." He began to stomp toward her, his heavy hand reaching for his handcuffs. "Put that thing down, woman! You're under arrest for the murder of Arthur Pendleton." But the mention of arrest seemed to ignite a final, frantic spark in the postmistress. She didn't drop the typewriter, she swung it with a surprising, desperate strength. The heavy cast-iron machine caught Blair squarely in the chest, the air leaving his lungs in a wheezing oomph as he stumbled back into the snow. In the confusion, Mrs. Wellington didn't try to reclaim the machine. Instead, she turned and bolted, her heavy boots slipping on the icy path as she scrambled toward the darkness of the kirk ruins. "After her! Anderson!" Blair gasped, clutching his ribs and turning an even deeper shade of purple. "Don't just stand there like a lamp-post! Catch her!" Anderson scrambled forward, but the snow was deep, and the ruins were a labyrinth of tumbled stone and jagged iron. Mrs. Wellington was a woman of the glen. She knew every inch of the kirkyard, even in a whiteout. She vanished into the swirling gloom of the old belfry, her frantic footsteps echoing off the stone. Hamish, however, didn't run. He moved with a long, steady stride, cutting across the frozen grass toward the rear exit of the ruins. He knew where she was going. There was only one place left for a woman who had lost her respectability, the high cliff edge where the kirkyard met the sea loch. He reached the stone wall just as she emerged from the shadows of the broken tower. The wind here was a physical force, screaming off the water and whipping the snow into a frenzy. Mrs. Wellington was standing at the very edge, her coat billowing around her like a shroud. She looked at the black, churning water below and then back at Hamish, her eyes wide and haunted. "It's over, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said, his voice carrying clearly over the gale. "There's no need for anyone else to get hurt. The secret's out now, and the loch won't take it back." He reached out a large, freckled hand, his expression one of grounded, weary empathy. "Come away from the edge. It's a long drop, and the water's far too cold for a lady of your standing." For a second, she looked like she might jump, her body swaying toward the abyss. But the sight of Hamish's steady, calm gaze seemed to tether her to the earth. The fight left her alone. She slumped against the stone wall, her sobs lost in the roar of the storm. Hamish walked forward and gently took her arm, guiding her back toward the lights of the van, where Blair was still shouting and Anderson was trying to catch his breath. The arrest was messy, cold, and profoundly undignified. But as Hamish looked at the shivering woman, he felt only a deep, quiet sadness for the cost of a village secret. The heavy doors of the police van slammed shut for the final time that night, swallowing Mrs. Wellington's broken sobs and the rhythmic thud of the typewriter that DCI Blair had insisted on seizing as his personal trophy of forensic brilliance. The vehicle lurched away into the white void, its tires churning through the slush as Blair leaned out of the window to bark a final condescending order at the lanky constable standing in the snow. And don't forget to lock the kirk door, Macbeth. I've done the heavy lifting, but I expect you to handle the menial clean-up. I'll be expecting a full report on my desk in Strathbanatho. I'll likely have to rewrite every word of your rural gibberish. Hamish watched the red glow of the taillights fade into the mist, his face a mask of dull, vacant compliance, until the sound of the engine was nothing more than a memory. Beside him, Jimmy Anderson lingered for a moment, his breath hitching in the cold. "You're a strange one, Hamish," Anderson whispered, shaking his head. "Giving him the credit for the violet ink theory, when we both know you made it up on the spot to flush her out. He's going to get a commendation for this, and Yow'll still be poaching salmon in a threadbare tunic." Hamish scratched his fiery red hair and offered a slow, deceptive lilt of a smile. "Now, Jimmy, if the superintendent thinks I'm a genius, hell have me sitting in a grey office in Glasgow, breathing in bus fumes and filling out forms in triplicate. But if he thinks DCI Blair is the hero of the Highlands, then Blair stays busy in the city, and I stay right here where the air is clean and the fish are plentiful. It's a fair trade, wouldn't you say?" Anderson chuckled, patted Hamish on the shoulder, and climbed into the support car, leaving the village to its rightful silence. Hamish turned and trudged back toward the manse. The minister, Mr. Brodie, was standing at the gate, his face illuminated by the soft glow of a lantern. "She's coming home, Hamish," the minister said, his voice thick with relief. "The radio says they've released Mary. They are dropping her at the hotel for the night. How can I ever thank you?" "No thanks needed, Mr. Brodie," Hamish murmured, adjusting his cap. "Just maybe a word in your next sermon about the dangers of keeping old secrets. They've a way of growing heavy in the dark." He returned to the police station, his boots squeaking in the fresh powder. Inside, the peat fire had burned to a comforting orange glow. Tozer had already reclaimed his spot on the rug, and Sonsi was perched on the cupboard, her tail twitching in a silent demand for supper. Hamish moved to the small stove and set a pot of water to boil. He reached into the back of the pantry and pulled out a hidden stash of real Highland butter and a jar of Mrs. Wellington's own raspberry Jemyronic, perhaps, but it was the best in the county. As the steam rose from his mug of coffee, Hamish sat by the window and looked out at the kirkyard. The snow was already beginning to fill in the frantic footprints of the night's drama, smoothing over the edges of the well and the belfry. The Sassenach Pendleton was gone, the lost Brodie secret was buried once more, and the social order of Lochstub had been restored to its quiet, sceptical equilibrium. He took a long, hot sip of his coffee, feeling the warmth spread to his tired bones. To the world in Strathbane, he was a useless peasant who had lucked into a front-row seat for a DCI's brilliance. To the people of Lochstub, he was just Hamish, the man who sat quietly and listened to the things they didn't say. He leaned back in his chair, a small, satisfied smile touching his lips. The storm had passed, the village was at peace, and most importantly, he was exactly where he belonged.